Hello, so this quick little book review is going to be about Scary Monsters and Super Creeps by Dom Joly, and this book was an interesting one. I picked this up knowing nothing about it, knowing nothing about the author, but the author kind of sounded a little bit familiar. It mentioned something called Dark Tourist, like on the back that he'd written another book called The Dark Tourist, which I'd also heard of and sounded interesting. But this one, when you read the back, you kind of get the gist that it's this guy who is fascinated by creatures and cryptids, like, you know, the abominable snowman, the yeti, you know, Nessie, the Loch Ness monster, and he's going off on this journey to basically investigate where these monsters came from. And he describes himself as a monster hunter, and you think, great, he's going to be off on this monster hunting journey, but the book doesn't really turn out that way. So yeah, it's written in a very interesting way, and basically the guy who wrote this is actually a comedian, and he's done a lot of TV shows in the UK, and I didn't realise who he was until it showed a picture of him, so I didn't know what his name was. Obviously it's Dom Joly, but there is in here somewhere at the beginning of every chapter, where is it? I mean, you can kind of see him in that one, but not great. But I recognised him as the guy. He mentions it as Trigger Happy TV, and I didn't know what that was, but my husband was like, when I came and I was talking to him about it, he was like, oh, I know who that is, and he showed me a clip. I don't know if you can see him better in that one, and he showed me a clip of the guy, and I recognised him as the guy of, there's a little sketch that I've seen of a guy who's like in a public library or in like a quiet space, like an art gallery or something like that, and he pulls out this gigantic phone and you hear the traditional Nokia ringtone, and then he goes, hello, and he shouts really loudly. It's that guy. Like, if you Google his name or put his name into YouTube, I'm sure it will come up with that clip. But yeah, so he's kind of like a known comedian in the UK, but I didn't know too much about him. I never watched those comedy sketches when I was younger. It was a bit before my time, but that was interesting. And as the story gets on, he is a very interesting guy. This book definitely isn't going to be for everyone, because in the beginning of the book he states very clearly that this book really is more about him travelling and the people he meets and the countries he's going to, which the countries he goes to are very interesting. He goes to some very interesting places, but it's not really about the monster hunting. Like, he does talk about the monsters very briefly at the beginning of each chapter, because each section of this book, he kind of introduces why he's going to this country and what he's looking for. Yeah, he goes to investigate 8 monsters. Obviously these are the 8 monsters, and then you have the foreword and the epilogue at the end. But yeah, it was an interesting book. The monsters are really interesting, and the countries he visited were very interesting. I think out of all the adventures, the ones I liked the most were probably Yeti. I think Yeti and possibly Bigfoot. But the narration style of this isn't going to be for everyone. He does come across as quite a arrogant person, and there are things and language he uses in this book which I feel like would be problematic to some people. It was very much like, I feel like his humour is very arrogant, almost shock humour. And even in some parts, like, I'm not really a sensitive person. I can read from whoever's perspective, but even in some parts I was like, oh, you're kind of coming off as a bit of a douche in this. Like, he's not very sensitive to other people's cultures, because he does go to quite out there places that are quite different, obviously, from his own culture, and he can be a little bit judgy in some places. Like, he's a people watcher and he comments on other people, and he makes quite a lot of unsavoury comments about other people, and some of his takes you're a bit like, I don't know how I feel about that. But then it would also be mixed in with a little bit of self-deprecation, and when it would go on to those bits, you're like, okay, I can see where like the humour is coming in. But some of the stuff you're like, does he actually mean that, or is he saying that for comedic value? It's not really sure. I would say if you're a fan of him anyway, like you watched his TV shows and you knew who this man was and you were a fan of his comedy style, then I think you would really enjoy this book. But otherwise, if you didn't know who he was, or you really don't like that arrogant sense of humour, he could be quite an unlikable narrator, which is problematic when it's, you know, it's not fiction, it's you're reading his real life experiences from his perspective. So yeah, I found it an interesting one. I kept going back and forth. I did find some parts funny. He does get himself into some really ridiculous scenarios. He calls himself this professional monster hunter. I'm guessing in kind of a sarcastic, funny way. But yeah, he basically just picks a monster that he finds really interesting. He goes to the country and location of the sightings of these monsters and then basically just wanders around. He doesn't do much actual investigative stuff. He just wanders around, talks to local people, which is interesting. But yeah, there's no actual active hunting, serious monster hunting, if I would say. It's just basically, yeah, he's wandering around these places where he doesn't really know where he is. He gets lost an awful lot and he talks to a lot of interesting people. But yeah, I think the most interesting one, one of the most interesting ones, is where he goes to the Congo. I thought that was quite interesting. I've never read like a travel journal before. I've never read a book like this before where you're following somebody who's travelling around. I'll have to look into some more books like this. If anyone has any suggestions for like, I don't know, like adventure or travel books, yeah, I've not read in that kind of genre before and I found that really interesting. I really like reading about people travelling to other countries and exploring. So yeah, if anyone has any kind of recommendations for me along that vein, I would find it really interesting. I think overall I would give this book a 3-star. It wasn't fantastic. Like I said, there were parts in the book where I was like, oh, that's kind of like a dodgy view on things. He made some like off comments about people because he goes to Japan in one of the for one of the monsters, and he's commenting about them wearing face masks, which I thought was really interesting because this book was published a while back. It was published way before COVID. Copyright, yeah, 2012. So yeah, this was written quite a while back, and yeah, I thought it'd be interesting, some of the comments he makes about travelling and some differences in culture and stuff. And just when he brought up the masks, I was like, oh yeah, it's weird to think like pre-COVID it probably was weird to see people wearing face masks and wondering why they were doing that. But yeah, it was an interesting one. If you're looking for like a real in-depth travel guide which really explains, like really explores other people's cultures and the way they live and the environment, then this book wouldn't be for you. And I'd say if you want a book that's like a book seriously investigating different monsters or different legends around the world, this also wouldn't be a good book for you because it doesn't really do either of those. It's just a comedian wandering around having like, I'm guessing a fun time. He seems stressed out an awful lot in this book, but yeah, a fun / amusing time. But yeah, it's not like hilarious, but it's definitely entertaining. I found it entertaining. I still don't know whether I like this guy quite so much. I have heard, like, it mentions Dark Tourist in this, and when I looked it up on Goodreads, everyone was saying if you enjoyed this, then read Dark Tourist, his other book. It's way better, and I'm guessing because that's more of a actual travel book, it might talk more about the places he's been. And he does go to some pretty strange places. He's not afraid to really go out there and just go for it. So yeah, maybe I'll pick up Dark Tourist and see what I think about that. But yeah, let me know what you guys think. Have you heard of this author before? Yeah, I'd only ever recognised him from glimpses from you know, like I said, sketch shows, like a TV sketch show in the UK. But yeah, it was an interesting one. Let me know if you've heard of it. And should I try Dark Tourist? And if you have any recommendations for travel adventure books, let me know. Because that was what I found most interesting when he was talking about other cultures and just going off and getting lost and wandering around and what he saw. He talks a lot about the food he eats, which I actually liked because I like hearing about food from other cultures, even though on some parts he wasn't so diplomatic on his thoughts of the food. It was an interesting one. So yeah, those are my thoughts, and as always, thank you for watching. Until next time, bye guys.